The story begins on a quiet morning when nothing on Earth seemed unusual. People were going to work, opening their shops, preparing breakfast for their families, or heading to school like they always did. The world felt normal, and no one expected anything different. In a small control room inside Earth's Global Communication Center, a few workers were doing their regular shift. Most of their job involved checking signals coming from satellites, measuring weather patterns, or comparing communication logs from different parts of the planet. It was the kind of work that usually felt routine. But on this particular day, something unusual happened. One of the senior operators was looking at a large screen that showed Earth's Space Monitoring Network. Normally, the lines on the screen were smooth, clean, and predictable. But suddenly, a strange cluster of dots appeared on the display. At first, the operator thought it was just a glitch. The system sometimes acted strange after updates or during solar storms. But when he zoomed in, the dots didn't disappear. In fact, they grew clearer. He stared at the pattern for a long moment, trying to understand what he was seeing. The dots were moving slowly, but they were moving toward Earth. He called another colleague over. The colleague checked the data again, running a quick verification test. The results didn't change. Something unknown was approaching the planet. It wasn't a meteor shower, it wasn't a satellite, and it wasn't any kind of space debris that Earth had records of. The objects were too organized. They were following a formation that looked deliberate. That was when the first wave of confusion spread through the young room. The communication center quickly alerted the global network. Soon, screens in monitoring stations from different countries showed the same pattern. Whatever was approaching Earth was visible to all systems. Experts who had been sleeping were called back to work. Scientists who were attending conferences or traveling were asked to immediately join emergency calls. Within an hour, the world's most trusted analysts were all staring at the same strange signal. Outside the communication world, everyday people had no idea what was happening. Families were sitting at dining tables, children were watching cartoons, and friends were meeting at cafes. Life was moving forward in the same peaceful rhythm. But deep inside the communication center, people felt a kind of tension they had not felt in years. No one wanted to jump to conclusions, but the approach of unknown objects had never been a simple matter. Before taking any further step, global leaders held a private emergency call. It wasn't dramatic or loud, but the seriousness was clear in every voice. They didn't want to alarm the public without understanding the truth. A mistake in communication could cause unnecessary panic. So the first decision was simple: observe, analyze, and stay calm. While the experts worked, the communication center tried to contact the unknown objects, sending standard inquiry signals into space. These were basic, peaceful messages that simply said, "Identify yourself." The signals went out in different frequencies and different formats, hoping something would respond. But there was no reply. Meanwhile, scientists began checking if the objects had any known origin. They compared every shape, every path, every movement pattern. They tried matching the objects with lists of old satellites, space probes, and even natural space formations. But nothing matched. The objects were still too far to see clearly, but their organized formation made it clear that they weren't random rocks floating in space. Hours passed, and the tension grew. By this point, more people inside the communication center knew about the situation. Some looked worried, others were curious, and a small number remained calm, trusting the system and their training. Everyone had the same question in mind, though few dared to say it aloud. What if this is something serious? There was one thing working in Earth's favor. Years ago, after a global crisis that had shaken nations, experts had created a special emergency transmission, a message not meant to threaten, but to warn calmly and firmly. The idea behind this message was simple. If anything unknown ever came close to Earth in a way that could cause harm, confusion, or misunderstanding, Earth would send a clear communication. First, instead of taking risky or aggressive actions, this message was created by a group of diplomatic thinkers, safety engineers, and communication specialists. They understood that fear often leads to mistakes, and mistakes in space can have huge consequences. So they designed a message that balanced firmness with peace. It didn't use threats. It didn't use harsh or emotional language. It simply requested any approaching object to stop, identify itself, and avoid any action that could result in misunderstanding. Over the years, the message had been improved and tested repeatedly, though it had never been used in real life. Some people believed it would never be needed. Others argued that it was one of Earth's most important tools. But no one imagined that its first real use would happen on such an ordinary day. Inside the communication center, a quiet vote took place among global leaders and scientific experts. They agreed that the unknown objects were too close to ignore and too silent to feel safe. They needed to follow the protocol. So they prepared the transmission, reviewing it carefully to make sure the language was respectful and free from any kind of threat. When the final confirmation was given, the communication officer stood in front of the transmission console. It wasn't the dramatic scene one might see in movies. The room was calm. People were focused, breathing slowly, waiting. The officer pressed a single button, and the message traveled into space. Halt. Identify yourself. Do not come closer until communication is established. We request peaceful contact to avoid misunderstanding. The message echoed into the open universe, carried by radio waves, traveling far faster than the approaching objects themselves. When the transmission ended, the room went silent. Everyone knew that now, all they could do was wait. The news had not yet reached the public, but a few rumors had started spreading on social media. Some people claimed the satellites were glitching again. Others thought it was just a regular update. A small group guessed it was something bigger, but no one had any clear information. The authorities had decided to wait before releasing details, only until they were certain. Back inside the communication center, emotions mixed in complicated ways. Some people hoped for a fast response. Others feared what a response might mean. Many simply wished the objects would turn away. The tension wasn't loud or dramatic. It was quiet, like the feeling before a storm. When the air becomes heavy, though nothing is visible yet, more monitoring stations joined the network. Engineers were adjusting antennas, checking signal strength, and recalibrating sensors to make sure nothing was missed. Scientists were analyzing the movement every minute, looking for any sign of slowing down or changing direction. The objects continued to move slowly but steadily. Outside, the world still moved at its usual pace. People bought groceries, drove to work, and walked in parks without knowing that the planet had just sent one of the most important messages in its history. The calm of daily life stood in sharp contrast to the quiet tension inside Earth's communication rooms. As the final hours of the day approached, the situation remained the same. No response. No change in movement. Just the steady silence of space pushing closer. But even in that silence, Earth held on to its most important quality, patience. The transmission had been sent. The request had been made. And the people responsible for the safety of the planet were doing everything they could, using calmness as their strongest tool. The first day ended with uncertainty, but it also ended with a strange sense of unity. Everyone inside the communication center felt connected by a shared responsibility. And even though ordinary people didn't know what was happening, the decisions being made were for their safety. In that quiet tension. Part 1 of the story closes with Earth waiting, watching, and hoping that the unknown objects would respond before getting any closer. Long before the strange objects appeared in the sky, The message Earth sent that day had been created by a special team of people whose work was mostly invisible to the public. They were not famous, they didn't appear on television, and no one outside their field even knew their names. But they were the ones responsible for keeping communication safe during times of uncertainty. Their job was to think about situations that nobody hoped would ever happen, and then create calm, well-planned responses that could guide humanity through confusion. The story of that message began many years earlier, after the world had dealt with a different crisis, one unrelated to space, but serious enough to teach everyone a lesson about communication. At that time, misinformation had spread so fast that people didn't know what to believe. There were misunderstandings between countries, between communities, and even between neighbors. It wasn't because of bad intentions. It was because of fear. Fear had made people react quickly and emotionally, creating problems that could have been avoided with clearer communication. When things finally settled, global leaders realized one thing: if such confusion could happen during a crisis on Earth, then the risk would be even greater if something unknown ever approached from space. So they created a new team, people who understood language, human behavior, diplomacy, and technical safety. Their task was to create a message that Earth could send instantly if anything unusual ever came near the planet. The team worked in a quiet room that looked more like a library and a command center. Papers filled the tables. Drawings covered the walls. They spent months discussing tone, wording, timing, and clarity. Some argued the message needed to be firm, so Earth didn't appear weak. Others believed it had to sound peaceful, so nothing could be misinterpreted. There were long debates, but the tone of those debates was always respectful. They weren't fighting. They were trying to protect humanity. One person in the team suggested something important. They said, if we ever need to send this message, the situation will already be tense. So we must remove all emotional words. Emotion confuses communication. Calm language saves lives. Everyone agreed. That idea became the foundation of the message. After months of work, the final transmission was created. It was short, clear, and respectful. It asked any approaching object to stop, identify itself, and wait for peaceful communication. It didn't mention aggression, fear, or threats. It focused only on avoiding misunderstandings. Once the message was ready, the team created a protocol around it, a set of steps that explained exactly when and how to send it. Training programs were built so communication officers across the world could understand every detail. The message was tested with simulation after simulation situations involving unknown objects, strange signals, drifting satellites, and even natural space debris that could be mistaken for something else. The message had to work in all situations, even when human emotions were running high. Many years passed. Technology improved. New satellite systems were built. New radar networks were placed around Earth, but the message remained the same. It didn't need updates. It was simple and timeless. Most of the team that created it eventually moved on to other work, other research, or retirement. Yet their creation stayed in Earth's emergency network, quietly waiting for a moment no one expected to ever come. When the unknown cluster of objects appeared, the old protocol woke up again. People who had never met the original team were now responsible for using their message. And although they had practiced the steps many times, using it for real felt completely different. Inside the communication center on that day, a group of experts gathered around a long table to review the old protocol. The room felt heavy, not because anyone was panicking, but because they all understood that what they were doing could affect the entire planet. Papers were passed around the table. Screens showed the approach of the unknown objects. Every decision, every step, had to be correct. One of the younger professionals there had only joined the team a few months ago. They had read the protocol many times, but had never imagined actually seeing it activated. They listened carefully to the discussions, trying to absorb everything. The room was filled with people older and more experienced, yet no one acted superior. Everyone treated the situation with the same seriousness. A senior member of the team explained the history of the message to the younger officers, making sure they understood why it was designed the way it was. They said, "This message isn't about power. It isn't about fear. It's about clarity. People panic when they don't understand something. We send this to prevent that panic from spreading. Communication saves more lives than force ever will." Those words stayed with the young officer for the rest of the day. Meanwhile, the objects continued moving slowly through space, still silent, still unknown. Scientists around the world observed them from different angles. Some tried to calculate their possible origins. Others checked their energy signatures. A few wondered whether the objects were artificial or natural. But there was one thing they all agreed on. The formation looked deliberate. Not aggressive, just deliberate, like a pattern that had been programmed long ago. As the data came in, a few theories were discussed. Some scientists believed the objects might be old probes from a distant part of space. Others thought they might be fragments of a broken spacecraft drifting together after a navigational failure. None of these theories were frightening. They were simply possibilities. But they didn't solve the mystery of why the objects were headed straight toward Earth. While the scientific teams worked, a small group of diplomats and communication experts focused on preparing for potential social reactions. They didn't want rumors to spread. They didn't want people to panic. They discussed how and when to release information to the public. They talked about transparency balanced with responsibility. They agreed that hiding the truth would cause more chaos in the long run. But revealing everything without understanding the situation would be just as harmful. One diplomat made a thoughtful observation. People don't fear the unknown. They fear what they imagine the unknown might be. The team nodded. That was why the message had been created all those years ago, to prevent imagination from turning into panic. As the object cluster drew closer, the decision to send Earth's emergency transmission became unavoidable. The protocol was followed step by step. A confirmation was needed from multiple regions. Then a second confirmation. Then the message was loaded into the system. It was reviewed by experts, checked for errors, and tested on signal simulators. Everything had to be perfect. When the final approval came, the communication officer prepared to send it. They stood quietly for a moment, not because they were afraid, but because they understood the responsibility of the moment. The room grew silent. People stopped typing. Others looked up from their screens. For a brief moment, the entire room seemed frozen. Then the message was sent. It traveled through long-distance transmitters, passed through satellite relays, and spread across the vast emptiness of space. On Earth, the moment was recorded in a digital log. There was nothing dramatic, no loud sound, no flashing light, just a calm message moving into the unknown. The people in the control room slowly returned to their work. They monitored every signal channel. They checked for any kind of response. They watched the object cluster's movement with renewed focus. Now that the message had been sent, the next step was simply to wait. And waiting, in moments like this, often felt harder than anything else. Meanwhile, outside the communication world, Earth continued its ordinary routines. People worked in offices, walked their dogs, ate meals with their families, and talked with friends. The planet's life moved gently forward, unaware that a message sent into space might change everything in the coming hours. Inside the communication center, however, time felt slower. The younger officer kept looking at the screen, wondering if the objects would respond. The senior members moved calmly, reminding everyone that silence didn't always mean danger. They all knew that the original team who created the message hadn't written it for dramatic moments. They wrote it to prevent fear, to protect people, and to give Earth a voice that spoke with calmness instead of emotion. As the silent objects drifted closer, that message became Earth's only bridge between caution and misunderstanding. No reply had come yet. But the world's first communication to the unknown had been made. What happened next would shape everything that followed. After the message was sent into space, the communication center felt different. No alarm was ringing, no one was running, and no dramatic scene was happening. But there was a quiet heaviness in the air that everyone could feel. People walked more slowly. Some took deeper breaths. Even the sound of computers humming seemed louder than usual. It was the kind of silence that happens when everyone is thinking the same thing, but no one wants to say it. The unknown objects were still moving toward Earth. Not fast, not aggressively, just steadily. The pattern on the screen looked almost peaceful, but that didn't make it any less unsettling. Everyone wanted to believe it was just sun-lost pieces of old space equipment, or maybe natural rocks floating in formation. But the silence made it hard to stay relaxed. The message had gone out more than once, translated into multiple frequencies. Still, no response across the planet. Life went on as usual. Children were playing outside, vendors were calling out prices in crowded markets, and office workers were complaining about deadlines. No one imagined that Earth had just asked the universe to stop and explain itself. The world continued spinning in its normal rhythm, while the communication center carried the weight of uncertainty. Inside the center, a small team of analysts was assigned to watch every tiny change in the movement of the objects. They monitored speed, direction, and energy readings. Every few minutes, numbers on the screen updated, and the analysts took notes. They didn't talk much. They knew that distractions could cause them to miss something important. A group of psychological specialists was also present. Their job was not to analyze the objects, but to help prepare for the possibility that the truth might need to be shared with the public. They weren't there to calm down panicking crowds. No one was panicking yet. Their role was to make sure any future announcement would be honest, clear, and gentle. They knew how delicate information could be when it reached millions of people at once. In a different room, a smaller team was discussing what silence could mean. They listed possible reasons why the objects weren't responding. Maybe the objects didn't have receivers. Maybe they were too old or damaged to pick up signals. Maybe they weren't built by anything that understood communication the way humans did. Or maybe the simplest explanation of all, they weren't active objects at all, just things drifting through space without awareness. No one suggested frightening theories. They had purposely agreed not to let imagination lead them. Their job was to wait for evidence, not to jump to dramatic conclusions. Every person in that room had trained for this, if not the exact situation. At least the feeling of unknown pressure. As the objects came closer, the communication center decided to inform a small circle of additional departments. These were officials who needed to know not to create fear, but to prepare backups of essential systems, reroute sensitive networks, and strengthen global coordination. The information was shared calmly. Instructions were simple: stay alert, stay quiet, stay ready. Hours passed, and finally, the first small piece of public awareness began to appear. A few amateur skywatchers noticed unusual readings on their home equipment. They posted online about strange movements in the sky. At first, people ignored it. But as more posts appeared, curiosity spread. Some people thought it was a new comet. Others joked that it was just another weather balloon. A few thought it might be something bigger, but didn't know what. Meanwhile, in the communication center, the waiting continued. One of the officers, sitting near the edge of the room, found themselves looking at a small digital clock every few minutes. The numbers seemed to change slower than usual. They felt a strange mix of calmness and restlessness. They weren't afraid. They were simply aware of the importance of the moment. Another officer, older and more experienced, noticed the restless look and walked over quietly. They didn't give a lecture or try to offer comfort. They just whispered something simple. Patience is also action. Those words settled the younger officer's nerves. Even if nothing was happening, the act of waiting carefully was part of their responsibility. As the day turned into evening, Earth's global leaders held another private conference. They were updated on everything: movement, silence, public activity, social media curiosity. They discussed whether to make an announcement. Some argued it was too early. Others worried that rumors might grow out of control. After a thoughtful discussion, they agreed to release a short statement that simply mentioned unusual readings in space and that scientists were studying them. Nothing alarming, nothing dramatic. The statement was released. News channels talked about it briefly. Some people paid attention. Many didn't. The world was used to hearing about new space discoveries, so most assumed it was something routine. Only a small portion of the population felt a slight uneasiness, though they couldn't explain why. Back at the communication center, the object cluster continued its silent approach. The room lights were dimmer now, as workers took shifts to rest, though no one truly relaxed. Some people sat with warm cups of tea or coffee, watching the screens with tired eyes. A few rubbed their foreheads or stretched their backs, trying to shake off the tension that had built up over the long hours. Every now and then, someone would check the communication log, hoping to see a new signal. But the screen stayed empty. The only sound that occasionally echoed through the room was the soft tapping of keys, or the quiet beeping of satellite updates. Late in the night, something unusual happened. Not a reply, not a signal, but a small irregularity in the movement of the objects. One of them shifted slightly, not in a sharp or sudden way, but just enough for the analysts to notice. The discovery caused a ripple of whispers across the room. The analysts checked their equipment, recalibrated the readings, and ran simulations. It wasn't a mistake. One object had drifted out of formation. People didn't know what to make of it. Was it random? Was it a natural adjustment? Or was it a sign that the objects were unstable? The room held its breath as the analysts observed for the next several minutes. After a while, the object slowly moved back into its original position. The formation remained intact. The incident didn't answer any question, but it reminded everyone that the objects weren't behaving exactly like simple rocks in space. That didn't mean they were dangerous. It just meant they were different. Outside, many parts of the world were now asleep. Streetlights glowed quietly, and most homes were dark. Only night shift workers, late-night drivers, and a few curious skywatchers were awake. Some of them looked up, wondering if something unusual was really happening above them. Inside the communication center, the atmosphere was still tense, but controlled. People were tired yet focused, quiet yet alert. The message had been sent. Earth had spoken. Now they needed a response, any response, to understand what was approaching. As midnight passed, small groups of officers gathered near the windows, just to stretch their legs. Some stared out at the night sky, even though they knew they couldn't see anything with their eyes. They stared anyway. Sometimes, looking at the sky made them feel calmer, as if they were connected to the very thing they were trying to understand. More hours passed, and still no reply. The objects were now closer than they had been at any previous point. They were still far away, but not distant enough to ignore. Scientists were preparing higher-resolution equipment to get a more accurate look. Engineers were adjusting receivers to capture even the faintest signals. The world was gradually shifting from curiosity to concern. One small moment stood out toward the end of the night. A young analyst, who had barely spoken all day, quietly said, "Maybe they don't understand us." The room fell silent. Not because the idea was surprising, but because it was possible. Maybe the objects had no communication system. Maybe they had no awareness. Maybe they were just drifting. Or maybe they were trying to respond in a way humans couldn't detect, yet no one knew. And that mystery weighed heavily on everyone. Part 3 ends in that long, quiet stretch of waiting. Earth had reached out with a calm voice. Space, for now, remained silent. And the world held its breath, unsure of what tomorrow would bring. The long night finally gave way to a pale morning sky, though no one inside the communication center had noticed the sun rising. The lights in the room stayed dim, the screens glowed softly, and the people looked more tired than before. Some had dark circles under their eyes. Some had gone quiet, saving their energy for whatever the day would bring. And some simply sat with their hands folded, staring at the data updates as if their eyes alone could force a response to appear. The unknown objects were now close enough for Earth's deep space cameras to get clearer images. Not perfect images, but better than the blurry dots from the night before. Engineers worked quickly, adjusting lenses, stabilizing the tracking systems, and enhancing the visuals. Every improvement, even the tiny ones, created a soft buzz of hope around the room. Slowly, the objects appeared on the screen, faint outlines at first, then sharper shapes. People leaned forward, not knowing what to expect. There were no dramatic gasps, but the quiet in the room deepened. The shapes looked unfamiliar, but not frightening. They weren't ships, at least not in any form humans recognized. They were more like clusters of structures, round in some places, flat in others, with long metallic lines that looked almost like antennae. Their surfaces were worn, as if they had been traveling for a very long time. A senior engineer lowered their voice and said, "These don't look new. Whatever they are, they've been through a lot." The objects didn't pulse with energy, didn't glow, didn't show signs of intelligent movement. They drifted in an organized pattern, but the pattern itself felt old, like something programmed ages ago. That alone gave the team its first clue. These objects weren't acting like active visitors. They were behaving more like abandoned travelers. Scientists working from a nearby room joined the communication center with printouts and early reports. Their voices remained calm as they explained that the objects had no clear propulsion. Whatever had guided them before had either failed or run out of power. They were simply moving through space with leftover momentum. The formation that looked deliberate might just be the result of how they stuck together, or how their shapes interacted with gravity. Another scientist added that they had detected faint signals, not communication signals, but old data logs repeating in loops, like recordings stuck in playback. This was the first real breakthrough. The objects weren't silent. They were just speaking a language humans had not recognized yet. When the team began decoding the weak signals, excitement quietly spread. The signals were extremely old. Not hundreds of years old, possibly thousands. This discovery brought more questions than answers. If the signals were that old, then who sent the objects? Where had they come from? And why were they heading toward Earth? Hours passed as translators, language experts, and signal analysts collaborated. The data logs were not messages directed toward Earth. They were more like travel journals, collections of scientific readings, navigation updates, and environmental scans. But many sections were corrupted, like pages in an ancient book that had been damaged by time. Slowly, the truth became clearer. The objects were not weapons, not scouts, not visitors. They were research probes, very old, very worn, and completely out of control. Someone in the room whispered, "They're not coming here. They're just drifting." Another person added softly, "They don't even know we're here." That realization hit everyone at the same time, not with shock, but with a deep, peaceful calm. The objects posed no real threat. They weren't alive. They weren't guided. They were survivors of someone else's scientific journey, still carrying data from places humans had never seen, still following a path their creators had once set for them. As the team continued decoding, more details surfaced. The probes had originally been part of a larger fleet launched by a distant civilization. The signals contained coordinates of stars humans had never mapped before. There were fragments of environmental recordings of planets with strange atmospheres and oceans of unusual chemicals. There were patterns that looked like temperature logs and others that resembled magnetic field readings. It was like reading fragments of a story from another world. But the most important discovery came from a damaged section of the logs. After careful analysis, the scientists realized that the fleet had experienced a major navigation failure. Something, maybe a cosmic storm, maybe a star explosion, had hit them and scrambled their systems. The probes had lost contact with their home civilization. Their propulsion had weakened, and in the vast emptiness of space, they had drifted for hundreds or thousands of years, slowly falling into a path that eventually brought them near Earth. The moment this truth became clear, the communications center felt lighter. People who had been tense for hours loosened their shoulders. Some let out long breaths they didn't know they were holding. A few smiled, not out of joy, but out of relief. The mystery wasn't solved completely, but the fear had faded. Still, even after understanding the object's history, the team had one more responsibility. They needed to determine if the probes could accidentally harm Earth. Not through attack, they had no such ability, but through collision or interference with satellites. Engineers worked together, calculating new trajectories. The results brought good news. The probes were large enough to be detected, but small enough to avoid major impact. Their path would not collide with the planet. They would pass by, slow down further, and eventually drift into deep space again. They were travelers just passing through in another room. A small group of Earth's leaders received the full report. They listened carefully, asked thoughtful questions, and made sure every detail was verified. The mood in their meeting was serious but hopeful. After the presentation, one leader said quietly, "We worried about something that didn't even know we existed." Another replied, "That's part of being human. We react first with caution. But we learned something valuable today." Back in the communication center, the team now faced a new task, deciding what message, if any, should be sent in return. The probes weren't functioning properly, so they wouldn't receive or understand anything. Still, the idea of sending one final message, something symbolic, felt meaningful. A small discussion took place. Some suggested sending a simple acknowledgement. Others proposed sharing Earth's location and peaceful intentions. But there was caution, too. Sharing certain information could be risky if the message ever reached an unknown civilization. After careful thought, the team decided on something balanced, a short transmission expressing peaceful greetings, respect for wherever the probes had come from, and hope that their original creators were thriving somewhere in the universe. The message was translated into multiple formats to increase the chances of being readable by someone or something far away. When it was finally sent, it wasn't dramatic. It was calm, like Earth's first message. Just a gentle voice in the endless space, acknowledging a civilization long lost to time. Meanwhile, outside the communication center, the public slowly learned more details. News channels explained that strange objects had been detected, but that scientists confirmed they were old, harmless probes from an unknown civilization. People reacted with curiosity, not fear. Many were fascinated. Some felt humbled. Teachers discussed it in classrooms. Families talked about it during dinner. Children looked at the night sky with new wonder, imagining who might have built the probes and what kind of world they came from. As the day went on, the communication center slowly emptied as shifts changed and the tension from the past 2 days faded. People went home tired but relieved. They stepped outside into the fresh air, noticing for the first time how calm the world looked. Cars moved normally on the roads. Birds flew across the sky. The sun was warm. Nothing had changed on the surface, but inside each person, something felt different, lighter, wiser, more connected to the universe. The silent travelers from a distant world drifted past Earth quietly, like old postcards carried by the wind. And humanity, for the first time, realized that not every unknown thing is a danger. Sometimes it's just a story from far away, accidentally finding its way into our part of space. Thought the world slept peacefully that night, not because the mystery was fully solved, but because the truth turned out to be gentle. The day after the truth came out, the world felt strangely quiet. It was the kind of silence that comes after a long storm, soft, deep, almost unreal. People were still trying to understand how close things had come to turning into a global disaster, even though the danger itself had never been intentional. All night, news channels had shown diagrams explaining how the old probes had malfunctioned and drifted off course. Social media was filled with people sharing their thoughts, their fear, their relief, and even some light jokes now that the tension was over. But behind all that, something bigger was happening. Humanity had just learned an important lesson, one that no book or teacher had ever been able to explain so clearly. Not every unknown thing is an enemy. Sometimes misunderstanding is the real danger. In offices, homes, and public places, people kept replaying the moment the message was decoded. They remembered the nervous voices of experts trying to explain to the world that the objects in space were not warships, not secret machines, not signs of invasion. They were only silent, damaged travelers from another place-old probes that had lost their way. That single piece of information had brought down the fear of billions in a matter of seconds. The communication centers on Earth remained active even after the confirmation. Teams were still studying the final signal from the probes, not because they were afraid anymore, but because they wanted to understand everything properly. The data logs inside the probes were faint and old. Parts were corrupted, parts unreadable, but some pieces showed glimpses of their origin. Simple recordings, patterns, measurements of stars and systems unfamiliar to any human scientist. Every small detail added to the curiosity spreading across Earth. People everywhere felt something they hadn't felt in a long time: unity. It didn't matter what country they lived in, what language they spoke, or what job they had. For one night, they had all looked up at the same sky and hoped for the same peaceful outcome. Even if the world would return to normal problems soon, that moment of shared emotion had left a mark. The team who years ago wrote the last transmission protocol met again for a briefing. Many of them were older now. They had not imagined that something they created long ago, something meant only for emergency use, would actually play such a huge role. One of them sat quietly, listening to younger officers talk about how the message saved everyone from panic. That person remembered clearly the day the protocol had been written. They had fought for a calmer tone, a message that warned without threatening, a message built not from fear, but from wisdom. And now, seeing its impact, the team felt a quiet kind of pride, not the loud kind, not the type people boast about, but the kind that warms you from inside, knowing that something you did once made the world slightly safer. In many homes, families gathered around breakfast tables, discussing the strange event. Some parents tried to explain to their kids what had happened, making sure not to scare them. Kids asked innocent questions like, "Do you think the people who made the probes will hear us? Or did they send the probes to say hello?" The adults didn't have answers, but they didn't mind. It was better for the future if children grew up thinking curiosity was stronger than fear. Meanwhile, in government buildings and scientific institutions, new plans began forming. Engineers, Communication experts and policymakers started reviewing the entire global response system. They discussed how to update the communication network, how to create faster decoding tools, how to improve space monitoring so no, object-friendly or not, would ever cause the same level of confusion again. Some wanted more advanced equipment. Others wanted more global cooperation. Many insisted that Earth should avoid creating fear-based responses. If anything threatened humanity again, communication had to remain the first step, not the last. The recent event had proven that peace was not weakness. It was wisdom. News. Networks interviewed people who had worked through the night during the crisis. One young technician shared how she had held her breath every time the radar refreshed. Another worker said he had not slept for nearly 30 hours because he couldn't leave his station while the world was waiting. They spoke humbly, not as heroes, but as people doing their job with dedication. Their honesty reached millions of viewers, showing again that ordinary people often carry the world in quiet moments. The world wanted closure. So Earth's communication network decided to send one more message into space. It was not a warning this time. It was a calm, hopeful broadcast created by a joint team of experts. The message said something simple. Your probes reached our world. They caused confusion, but no harm. We hope, if you still exist, that one day we can exchange knowledge peacefully. It wasn't poetic. It wasn't dramatic. But it was sincere, and that sincerity made it powerful. The message was sent out with a strong transmission beam, so it could travel far, beyond Earth's usual reach. No one knew if anyone would hear it. Maybe the civilization that launched the probes didn't exist anymore. Maybe they were too far. Maybe they never intended the probes to be found. But none of that mattered. Sending the message was a reminder of what kind of world humanity wanted to become calm, patient, open. In the following days, schools used the event to teach students about space, science, and communication. Teachers explained how fear can grow when people don't know the truth, and how calm actions can prevent chaos. Students watched simulations of the drifting probes and talked about what they would do if they could explore the universe. Some dreamed of becoming astronauts, scientists, or engineers. Others just felt inspired to stay curious about the unknown instead of running from it. The media slowly moved on, but the story stayed in people's hearts. There were documentaries, short films, podcasts, all discussing how a misunderstanding almost caused global disaster, yet ended with relief and new lessons. People admired how the world had handled the situation without aggression. They liked that no one had overreacted. It felt mature, reassuring. In quiet homes, some people sat alone replaying the moment the message had been sent. Halt, identify yourself, or risk consequences of misunderstanding. They realized how important those words were. They weren't a threat, they were protection. Protection for Earth, yes, but also protection for anyone who might cross paths with humans in the vastness of space. Sometimes, during late nights, people still looked up at the sky differently. Not with fear anymore, but with curiosity and maybe a bit of wonder. They knew they weren't alone, not in a scary way, but in a comforting, mysterious way. Somewhere out there, far beyond what human eyes could see, someone had once launched probes meant to explore or record. And now Earth had responded, telling them that their creations were found, studied, and respected. Some scientists worked on studying the data from the probes. They didn't expect anything dramatic, but even small bits of information were valuable. Star maps, patterns in cosmic radiation, energy readings. Each piece contributed to a better understanding of the universe. The scientists weren't in a rush. They were patient. After all, the event itself had taught everyone that rushing leads to fear, and fear leads to misunderstanding. At the communication center, one older team member stood near a large screen that still displayed the decoded final message. The lights reflected softly on the text, giving it a quiet glow. The person smiled gently and whispered, almost to themselves, "At least the world remembered to breathe." The people who had stayed awake through the crisis slowly returned to their routines. But they carried a new sense of responsibility with them. They knew that Earth had reacted well this time, but they didn't want to rely on luck again. Humans had to be better prepared. Not to fight, but to understand. The event turned into a symbol, a reminder that humanity's strength wasn't in weapons or defenses, but in communication, patience, and unity. Even leaders who often disagreed found a moment of common ground, acknowledging that calm thinking had prevented unnecessary chaos. Months later, the story still surfaced in conversations, in friendly discussions, in science classes, in documentaries, and even in quiet moments between strangers. It had become part of Earth's shared memory, something people would talk about for years. Humanity didn't know if their new message into space would ever reach anyone. But that no longer mattered. What mattered was the intention behind it. What mattered was that Earth had shown maturity, caution, and wisdom in a moment of great uncertainty, and that intention would remain floating in space for years. Maybe centuries an open hand stretched toward the unknown, a sign that humans, despite their fears and flaws, had learned something important. Not every unknown is a threat. Not every silence means danger. Sometimes peace begins with one calm message sent into the dark.